right. And someone already confirmed earlier, but can we confirm? Well, hold on, not yet. 1 second. Let's see. It's recording. Entire screen. All right. Can one person please confirm that you can hear me and see the slideshow?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. So less than 1 minute. So I remind everybody, as always, most people are starting to get it, but a few people still forget. So I'll keep reminding you until I get good results. Make sure to email me for attendance every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. What else? That's mostly it for reminders. Does anybody have any questions about the course in general as opposed to chapter 3? All right, then. I'll give it a couple more seconds. I do want to wait until 8. That way nobody misses anything. Oh, yeah, I will remind you, take a look at Google Classroom to remind yourselves. But if you want some extra independent work points, you can sign up and get your COVID test at the health department, or, the health department here on campus. I need to do it myself. I just haven't had a chance. So it's an easy way to earn 5 points, in my opinion. And it's one of those spit tests, too. So it's not that brain swab, as they call it, that one that goes deep in your nose. You just have to spit in the tube and you're done. But anyway, let's move forward. We ended up, we talked about organic compounds in general, and you know what you need to know for the exam, and you know what you need to know to understand the rest of this chapter. But to remind you, I guess the most important thing as far as the discussion we're about to have, the most important thing from that bullet point was this idea of monomers and polymers. So you guys remember that a polymer is made up of monomers, right? So a monomer is like a particular molecule. If you put those together, like a bunch of repeating monomers, you get a polymer. And that's going to be a common theme in everything when we talk about carbs and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids, because you're going to need to know for each one of those. I'm going to say, what is the monomer of the carbohydrate? What is the polymer of the carbohydrate? What is the monomer of the protein or lipids? What's the polymer? So on and so forth. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this. Also, to remind you, a dehydration reaction is a reaction that brings together monomers, and a hydrolysis reaction is a reaction that breaks up monomers. So that being said, let's move forward. We did the introduction to carbohydrates. You know that they include things like sugars, like the kind you would find in your sodas. You know that it includes stuff like the starch that you would find in pasta, for example. And I think usually, from conversations I've had with people, usually when they think of carbohydrates, that's what they think of. But anyway, let's get started and talk about monosaccharides. Monosaccharides are the monomers of carbohydrates, so you do need to know that. And the reason that they are the monomers of carbohydrates is because they cannot be broken down into smaller sugars. If you do a chemical reaction to a monosaccharide and you change it and you break it down, at that point, it is no longer a sugar. So everything else we talk about, it's going to be polymers of these monosaccharides. So if you break those polymers down, you're just going to end up with monosaccharides. So that's how that works. Again, for the exam, the most important thing you need to know about monosaccharides is they are the monomers of carbohydrates. Here's some examples. For the exam, you do not need to know the examples, but I think if I remember correctly, the study guide might include some of these examples. But anyway, glucose is common in sports drinks. Glucose is also a really important one. We talk about glucose a lot in this semester, starting, I think, at least chapter 6. So glucose will come back. Fructose, you can find that in fruit. And both of these simple sugars can also be found in honey. And I'll show you that on the next slide. But are there any questions about what's on this slide, about what a monosaccharide is? If you're interested in it, it would be you can look this up for independent work. What are some of the other monosaccharides? Because this just says common examples. So obviously there's other examples out there if you want to look into it. But yeah, they're both in sugar, or both of these simple sugars are found in honey, and I find this interesting. You can see here, again, none of you are biologists, none of you are chemists, so I don't expect you to look at this and know exactly what it means. But even though you don't know exactly what it means, you can at least see that these two things are in different places, right? So they have a different structure, but they have the same formula, C6H12O6. Now, again, these are just examples. In this exam, I'm not going to ask you what the formula is for glucose. I'll never ask you what the formula is for fructose. So this is just an example. When you're studying, don't feel like you need to memorize this. But this is a great example of an isomer. And an isomer is something that has the same formula, but a different structure, different arrangements. And you do need to know that for the exam. You need to know what an isomer is. And again, you can see they have the same formula, the same number of carbons and hydrogens and oxygens. It's just that this carbon double bonded to an oxygen is over here instead of over here. That's a slight difference. And the funny thing is, there is a slight different taste. Fructose is a little bit sweeter than glucose. And the reason being, at least for humans, is, these fit onto different molecules on our tongue. So our tongue receives that differently. It sends a different message to our brain. But are there any questions about this? All right. We already talked about this. Glucose and fructose are isomers. Again, you don't need to know that glucose and fructose are isomers. You just need to know that isomers are molecules that have the same molecular formula, but different structures, right? The same C6H12O6, whatever it may be, whatever the formula may be, that part's the same, but the way you arrange it, that's the different part. So that's the important part. Again, the glucose and fructose, those are just examples, so I'm not going to require you to memorize that fact for the exam. So any questions so far? Okay. Here's another example. This is not in your book, and this is actually on a TV show. So when I first saw this on TV, I was pretty thrilled that they talked about it. I was like, yeah, it's a great example. So does anybody know what these molecules are? Not that I expect anyone to. But anyway, you can see that they have almost, well, first of all, they do have the same, not that you can see this, but they have the same chemical formula, not that it shows it, but they have the same chemical formula, and they almost have the same structural formula. You've got that double ring there, line here, line here, line here. Everything looks the same, except that's a mirror version of that. When you get into organic chemistry, which you guys won't, but there's actually big differences between those two. One of those, this molecule, is the one that you find in Vapor Rub. This is the stuff that gives it that menthol feeling and smell. And the other one is the one you use to make meth. So again, you can see that these isomers, my point here is that even if you change something slight, even if it has the same chemical formula, and in this case, almost the same structure, just a mirrored version of it, you can make something completely different. So even though we don't talk much about isomers in this class, I'm glad your book does bring it up, because there are some isomers out there that's how it reacts with your body. Some things could be poison, some things you need. So isomers are very important in biology as a whole, just not so much in this class because we don't dive into that much detail. All right. Maybe I'll ask you this. So yeah, you know what a monosaccharide is. You know what isomers are. Most importantly, you know that monosaccharides are the monomer of carbohydrates. But I might also ask you this, and hopefully you're asking yourself the same thing, like, why do we care what monosaccharides are? It's because they are the main fuels for cellular work. And again, you're going to learn a lot about glucose in chapters 6 and 7. It's all about glucose, photosynthesis and respiration. It's all about the glucose. So that's why this is important. In water, they form rings. That's not important for the exam. This bullet point is more important for people who have really strong attention to detail, because later on when I show you some pictures of monosaccharides, you might think, well, that's not what they looked like at first. At first you showed them they looked like this, and now you show them and they look like these little rings. So what happened? So that's the little disclaimer. When you put these monosaccharides in water, sometimes they will fold up on themselves and form rings. So again, not an important bullet point for the grand scheme of things, unless you're just one of those people who really pay attention to detail. So any questions about this slide? All right, here's what I mean. Here's the picture I showed you. Remember, this is what the glucose looked like. And then, like I said, if you put it in water, it kind of folds up on itself and you have rings. And again, as far as the exam is concerned and as far as studying is concerned, that's not really important. But later on, when I show you the polymers, because remember, polymers are long strings of monomers, right? So instead of the polymers, these carbohydrates being strung together like this, it's the rings that are strung together. So again, for the exam and for studying, that's not important. I'm just pointing that out there so you don't get confused when you see these pictures of all these rings linked together. So nothing to memorize here. But is there any questions about this slide? We're making real good time. Man, real good time. Yeah, it's only 8:08. All right. So we're done talking about monosaccharides, which is, one sugar. Next thing we're going to talk about is disaccharides. Can anyone guess how many sugars are in a disaccharide? Yes, 2, right? It's in the name, di. Disaccharides, these are double sugars constructed from 2 monosaccharides. If you're taking notes, shorthand, the best thing to write would be disaccharides equals double sugar. Of course, it's constructed from monosaccharides because, like I said, when we talked about monosaccharides, all the carbohydrates are made up of monosaccharides. So, yes, the important thing here is disaccharides are double sugars. These are some examples. This picture is actually not from your book, but your book does talk about them. Sucrose, lactose, maltose, and it even tells you the monomers that make them up. Sucrose, which is table sugar, is made up of glucose and fructose. Lactose is made up of galactose and glucose, so on and so forth. This is nothing that you need to memorize for the exam. I think in your study guide, it does say, what is lactose? Is it a monosaccharide, a disaccharide, or a polysaccharide? So maybe for the study guide, you might need to know this, but for the exam, I'm not going to ask you that. We'll talk a little bit more about disaccharides, but does anybody have a question about what the definition of a disaccharide is? Just a double sugar, right? Pretty simple. So this is, I'm not going to go through this video because if you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this video. It basically shows glucose and fructose coming together to make sucrose. And does anybody remember, not that I expect you to yet, but you will, does anybody remember what kind of reaction that would be when you bring these two together? That's okay. It's a dehydration reaction. You'll get it before the exam. See, there's the picture of it. Bring together glucose. Well, this is glucose and galactose. Different molecules, but same concept. You're bringing together 2 monosaccharides to make a disaccharide. That is a dehydration reaction, and it's called a dehydration reaction because it's almost like you're squeezing a water molecule out of it. But yeah, that's the sugar found in milk. And again, this is just an example. There's nothing to memorize this on this slide for the exam. Again, some examples that we've already talked about. You've got lactose in milk, maltose, which you can find in beer, malted milkshakes, malted milk ball candy, which is, what's that? What are those things called? Yeah, Whoppers, thanks. This is straight from your textbook, so I guess they didn't want to give any kind of props to the brand name. They might have to pay money or something. I don't know. But anyway, yeah. So those are some examples from maltose. And then, of course, this is the big one, sucrose, because when people say sugar, that's usually what they think of, at least in non-biological terms. When you go to the store and buy sugar, that's what you're buying is sucrose. It's table sugar. Your book points out that sucrose is the main carbohydrate that you find in plant sap, because basically that's where we get it, right? You've got sugar cane. Basically what they do is they take the sap out of that cane and they boil it down and they get all the liquid out, and you're just left with the actual, what we know is sugar. Your book also mentions high fructose corn syrup, and I'm sure you've heard of it. If anybody has like a soda on you, it doesn't look like anyone does, but if you to look at it, one of the first ingredients is high fructose corn syrup. So even though we think of sugar as sucrose, like table sugar, that's the sugar we buy. Usually when companies make processed foods, they don't use real sugar. They use this high fructose corn syrup. The way they do that is they convert glucose to the much sweeter fructose. I talked about that earlier when I showed you those pictures of the isomers. For some reason, our tongue perceives fructose as sweeter. So I guess if you're trying to make sweets, right, if you make cookies or sodas or whatever, you're trying to make something taste sweet, obviously high fructose corn syrup would be better for that. Like I said already, it's one of the first ingredients listed in soft drinks, and it's cheaper. It's cheaper to make high fructose corn syrup than to actually grow and process sucrose. So that's one of the reasons you see it so much. This is just an example. This is just for your everyday knowledge because, again, high fructose corn syrup is in everything. So it's good for you to know, but I'm not going to ask you any questions about high fructose corn syrup on the exam. This is how they make it. So this is where it gets its name. Well, I'll just start from the beginning. Obviously, that's corn, right? When you think of corn, what do you think of as far as, I don't know, dietary things. Do you think of protein or starch or carbs? Yeah, right. Carbs, right? Starch. So what happens is they take the starch, and you're going to learn this later, but starch is nothing but a bunch of glucose molecules tied together, right? Because it's a polymer. And then they break those chains down, so you're left with nothing but the monomers, which is the glucose. And then they use an enzyme to, remember, they kind of switch that carbon from that place to that place, meaning they switch it from glucose to fructose, and that makes it sweeter. And then there you go, and they put it in your foods. And again, I'm not going to ask you this. This is not important for the grand scheme of biology, but it's good to know for your everyday life because high fructose corn syrup is in almost everything. Yeah, corn is too. Here's some other stuff that I won't ask you about on the exam, but I'm glad your book included it because it's relevant to your everyday life. Your book points out that the average American consumes about 130 pounds of sugar per year. And mainly it's sucrose and high fructose corn syrup. Obviously, you probably already know the reasons that it's bad for you, but I'll talk about it anyway because your book did. It's a major cause of tooth decay, as you can see here, and overconsumption. This leads to things like obesity and such, which then increases the risk of type 2 diabetes and heart disease, and basically they're empty calories. So yeah, you know, calories gain you to cause weight or cause you to gain weight, but sometimes calories can be good because you need proteins and you need complex carbohydrates and you need things like that. But you don't necessarily need a lot of these simple sugars or these disaccharides. So again, none of this is going to be on the exam. This is just for your everyday life. So any questions about this slide? Anyway, this is another good topic for independent work if you're into it. If you look at the public health aspect of what sugar is to our diet, something to look into. All right, so if there's no questions about that, then we'll jump into the final category of carbohydrates, which are polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are complex carbohydrates or complex carbs. And what are complex carbs? They are long chains of sugars. So basically, last thing we talked about was two sugars. So now it's just, instead of having two sugars put together, we're just talking about a bunch of sugars put together. It's actually pretty simple when you think about it that way. And as always, or as I've already said with disaccharides, they are the polymers of monosaccharides. So in my opinion, when you talk to somebody about carbs, a lot of times this is what they mean when they say carbs. Like someone who's not a nutritionist or somebody who's not a biologist, when they just use carbs in the layman's term, this is usually what they mean. They usually mean complex carbohydrates. I see people taking notes, so I'm going to pause for a little bit, but does anybody have any questions about this slide? Because we'll talk a little bit more about polysaccharides moving forward, but if there's no questions, no one seems to be taking notes. Here we go. As always, there's this video you can download that shows all these monomers coming together in dehydration reactions. So there's three different types of polysaccharides that you're going to learn about, and you're going to need to know the difference between the three of them. So keep that in mind as I talk about them. And the first one is starch. So like we've already said, all polysaccharides are long strings of sugars, right? Starch is a long string of glucose monomers. As a matter of fact, though, you know what? If you're taking notes, you don't even necessarily need to write that down because all of them that I'm going to show you are long strings of glucose monomers. So that does not make starch different than any of the other three. And again, for the exam, you're going to need to know the difference between all three of them. So it's good to know that they're made from strings of glucose, but again, that's nothing that makes it unique. Starch is used by plants to store energy. That is something you do need to know. Plants use starch to store energy. As far as we're concerned in this class, that is the purpose of starch, for plants to store energy. Your book does point out that potatoes and grains are a major source. You don't need to know that for the exam. That's just for your own knowledge. For the exam, the most important thing you need to know is that starch is what plants use to store energy. And of course, we get energy from it too, right? Because it is energy. Even though your plants use it to store energy, we can then eat that and then break it down and release the energy. And we ourselves use the energy. But starch, again, plants use it to store energy. And again, this is something else you could look into for independent work if you're into it. All I said from the book was that potatoes and grains are major sources. So you could look into that, specifically which grains. Where do we get starch from our diets? so on and so forth. So any questions about starch? All right, here's a picture of it. This is an actual picture of a microscope. So you zoomed into this plant cell and you can see these little nodules of starch. And this is what it looks like at the molecular level. So you can see each one of these little rings, is a glucose monomer, right? Glucose. All it is a bunch of glucoses chained together, right? They've been put together in a dehydration reaction or mini dehydration reactions. What I won't require from you on the exam is to know this. So yeah, you need to know that starch is how plants store energy, but I'm not going to show you a picture of starch and say, what is, you do not need to identify it by the way it looks, basically. The next one you need to learn about is glycogen. So if starch is what plants use to store energy, glycogen is simply what animals use to store energy. So know that for the exam. Starch is for animals, starch is for plants, glycogen is for animals. It's mostly stored in the liver cells and then broken down in muscle cells. That's for your own knowledge. That won't be on the exam. This is not a human anatomy and physiology class. And the way it's broken down and the reason it's broken down is because when we need energy, when our cells need energy, what we need is glucose. So, and again, you can see these are just chains and chains of glucose. So imagine you say, oh, I need some energy. I need a glucose. You can just lob one off the end of the chain there. And then you need another glucose, lob the one off the end of the chain. So it's basically like just a bunch of food or a bunch of energy all packed together.
Is that what happens? Get excited or get scared? Like adrenaline kicks in?
Sort of. Yeah, when your adrenaline kicks in, that because your whole process is move quicker, your cellular processes, then everything your cells do needs energy. So anytime they're doing stuff quicker, they're going to need more energy. Therefore, they're going to need more glucose. Yeah. So, and again, hopefully this picture looks familiar, even though you're not required. It should look a lot like starch, right? Let's back it up. That's what starch looks like, right? It's nice and simple, just zigzags of monomers of glucose. And look, glycogen's similar, right? It's the same thing, except it branches off a little bit, which makes sense because like we said in chapter 1, there's this thing called structure and function, right? So you can see that these things have similar structures, therefore they're going to have similar structures. So does anybody have any questions about glycogen? All right. Let's talk about cellulose, the third and final that you're going to learn about anyway in this class. Cellulose, first of all, is the most abundant organic compound. Know that first bullet point. It is the most abundant organic compound. You should know that for the exam. But what happens is it forms basically like cables, like it says from the textbook, almost like these. Imagine like those metal cables that help hold some buildings together. It's almost like that, except they're obviously it's not made of cable. It's basically what makes the cell wall of a plant. It cannot be broken down by enzymes produced by animals. So when animals eat cellulose, we can't digest it, which might make you think, oh, well, that's useless then, right? Why do we need to eat it if we can't digest it? But the reason is because that is what fiber is. So fiber is cellulose. Cellulose is fiber. And fiber is good for you because you can't digest it. Because when you eat it and it goes undigested, it kind of cleans you out and gets all the stuff out of your system that doesn't need to be hanging around in your system. For the exam, basically, again, you should know that cellulose is the most abundant organic compound on Earth. And also, basically, you should associate cellulose with plant structure, right? So starch is plant energy, cellulose is plant structure, and glycogen is animal energy, right? And in a nutshell, that's what you should memorize for the exam. I hate to use the word memorize because I prefer you to think than memorize, but it is a 100 level class, so sometimes you just need to memorize. So any questions about this slide? Okay. I like this. I found this on the internet. I've said this before, not this specifically, but I said a lot of times people will try to scare you. Why? I don't know. Especially with social media, people just love conspiracy theories and crap like that. Anything, I guess, to make themselves feel smart. I don't know. Anyway, so I saw this thing about McDonald's, and they're like, "Oh, do you really want to eat this? Let me tell you what's in your food." But first of all, before we even get into it, I will say, obviously, McDonald's is pretty much unhealthy. So I'm not arguing that McDonald's is healthy, but I am arguing some of the crap that's on here. And obviously, I'm just going to stick to the one. If you see here, where'd it go? Saying wood. Oh, yeah. So it says that there's wood in their food, right? But there's not. But they did it without completely lying, because cellulose is in wood, right? So when you look at wood, you know, when you see a tree, other than the greenness, when you see a tree, mostly what you're looking at is cellulose, because that is what makes up plants. But cellulose is also the stuff you find in lettuce and the stuff you find in any other plant material, right? So it's good for you. So they do this without technically lying. They're saying, oh, cellulose is in wood, therefore wood is in your was in your food at McDonald's, and that's not true. So this is the kind of crap you have to look out for, and hopefully, as a college-educated person, once you graduate, this is the kind of crap that you'll correct people on. Not that it's that important. Like I said, McDonald's is bad for you, but people just spread lies, and a lot of times I don't think they mean to. And it's easy to lie to people, because again, if someone were to look this up and be like, oh, I'm a critical thinker, I'm not just going to believe anything, any meme I read on the internet. And then they read and they go, whoa, yeah, cellulose is in wood. And if they leave it at that, then sure enough, and that in their minds, this is the correct meme, and there is wood in your McDonald's. Anyway, any questions about cellulose? All right, here's a picture of it. It should look very familiar. Again, it's these glucose linked together, but you can see in this case, unlike in starch and glycogen, it's not zigzagging, right? It's a straight line. And again, structure function, even though none of you are biologists or chemists, you don't necessarily know what this structure means, but you can at least look at it and say, wow, yeah, that is a little bit different than the other two I saw, which makes sense because its function is a little bit different. The other two were there to store energy. This one is here for structure. It's to give the plant wall its form. This is a table that's not from your book. All this information is from your book, but I just put it in one nice little table. So as you're studying, I would use this table. It's really puts everything together because, again, for the exam, you need to know the difference between starch, glycogen, and cellulose. So this is all how they're different and how they're the same. And again, this whole thing we've been talking about, starch, glycogen, and cellulose, those are all fall under the category of polysaccharides. Also, another good idea for independent work, these are just 3 polysaccharides we've talked about. There's many, many more polysaccharides. These are just the ones you need to know for the exam and the ones you need to know to understand the rest of the semester. So if you're interested, you could look up some of the other polysaccharides. Excuse me. And there's all the pictures we've seen together. We've already seen all these. They're just all put on the same picture. All right, does anybody have any more questions about carbohydrates? All right, let's see if we can finish up lipids, and then maybe on Friday we can finish up proteins and nucleic acids and be done with chapter 3. All right, lipids. Hopefully when you think of lipids, you should think of fats. Before we get into that, though, your book points out, it's interesting that they do it this way, because I feel like we should have talked about this earlier, but I do it the way the book does it. Your book points out that carbohydrates, the ones we just got finished talking about, those are all hydrophilic. So everything we've talked about so far is hydrophilic, meaning it's water loving, right? So those molecules dissolve in water. And I'm sure you guys already knew that, even if you just didn't know the word. I'm sure you know if you put sugar in warm water, it'll dissolve, right? That's because carbs are hydrophilic. Lipids are the opposite. Lipids are hydrophobic, meaning they cannot mix with water. So hydrophilic things and hydrophobic things kind of repel each other. For example, in this picture here, oil and vinegar. Oil is obviously hydrophobic because it's a lipid. And vinegar is hydrophilic, so they repel each other. And I'm sure you've seen that before. I'm sure you've seen like Italian dressings where it's separated until you shake it. And then when you shake it, it's not truly getting mixed. What's happening is you're just getting little bubbles of the oil that's kind of surrounded by everything else. But anyway, the important thing here for the exam anyway is the definition of hydrophilic. You know the definition of hydrophobic. You know carbs are hydrophilic, and you know lipids are carbs are hydrophilic, and liquids are hydrophobic. So make sure you know those things. And I think the easy way to remember it, first of all, like I said, just remember you can dissolve sugar in water, so that can help you remember carbs are hydrophilic. And then think about, like, I don't know, if you try to put oil on water, right, you can see that it just doesn't mix. So if you can remember that, then you should be good for the exam. But are there any questions about this slide? All right. Lipids are different from carbs, which we already talked about, and proteins and nucleic acids, which we're going to talk about later, which in my opinion is why I think we should do lipids last and not here. But again, I teach out of the book. The way that they're different is they're not necessarily huge macromolecules. So when you think about like starch, for example, and glycogen and cellulose that we just talked about, that's like long strings of glucose, right? Really long. They're really huge. Same thing with DNA, which we'll talk about when we talk about nucleic acids. Those things are huge. Same things with proteins, very large. Lipids are relatively small. And they're also not technically polymers built from repeating monomers. None of this is going to be on the exam. I'm just kind of like giving you a frame of mind before we jump into it. But yeah, so again, starch, it's a bunch of repeating glucose, right? Later, when we talk about proteins, you're going to know that proteins are a bunch of repeating amino acids. When we talk about nucleic acids, you're going to learn that those are a bunch of repeating nucleotides, right? So all the other three are repeating monomers, the same monomer strung together. And that's not necessarily the case with lipids. Lipids are made up of different parts, and you will need to know the different parts that make them up, but they're not technically polymers built from monomers. They are a diverse group of molecules that are made from different molecular building blocks. So again, nothing on this slide is necessarily going to be on the exam. This is just stuff for you to keep in the back of your mind as we move forward and discuss lipids. But are there any questions about what's on the slide? All right. So basically, what we're going to look at when we talk about lipids, we're going to break them down into two categories, which are fats and steroids. So you need to know the difference between fats and steroids. And for independent work, if you want to look up some specifics about these, feel free. All right. So if you're taking notes, what you could write for this bullet point is fat equals triglyceride, meaning when you hear the word triglyceride, you should think of fat, at least in this class and this chapter. When we say fat, what we really mean is a triglyceride. The way it gets its name, and again, like I said, you need to know the parts. Triglyceride is a glycerol molecule that has 3 fatty acids joined to it. Now, I'm not concerned that you know the specific number of 3 fatty acids. Just know a triglyceride, the parts that make it up are glycerol and fatty acids. You can just think about it like that. Triglyceride is made up of glycerol, fatty acids. So it's the fatty acids that are the long and energy-rich part. The glycerol is just basically the part that holds it together. I probably won't ask you that on the exam. It's just for your own knowledge. Your book does point out that these fats have twice the energy, like per weight, as carbohydrates. And fat is the stuff that's stored in your adipose cells. And I think you knew this too. You probably just never heard it, or maybe have just never heard it said that way. Because usually when people think of fat, and you're not sitting in a biology class, and you're not talking to a dietitian, when people think fat, they think of like the fat that's on their body, for example, right? And that's what this last bullet point is. Adipose cells, those are fat cells. So when you have too much fat, or when you make your own fat, that's where you store it. So any questions about this slide? This little picture here, which again, I didn't make, I just find these. This is a good example of hydrophobic and hydrophilic, right? So that's a little water molecule trying to hang out with this little fatty acid chain. And they can't because, you know, the fatty acid chain is hydrophobic. Anyway, again, if you download the PowerPoint, there's this quick little video you can watch. It's going to show the glycerol coming together with the fatty acids to make a triglyceride. Again, just like everything else we've talked about so far in this chapter, when you bring these molecules together, that is a Dehydration reaction. So yeah, again, you do need to know that when you bring molecules together, that's a dehydration reaction. Otherwise, everything else in this picture, it's just an example, and you do not need to memorize anything from here. You certainly don't need to know the exact structure of the glycerol and the fatty acids and all that. But are there any questions about this picture? All right. So let's talk about some of these essential functions of fat. Like, why do we have fat? This picture is a good hint for one of them. So can anybody guess why we need fat?
Cushion, muscles.
Good. Cushion is one of them. I chose that picture because I figured it might be inappropriate if I showed a picture of someone's butt, but it's the same concept. That's why you have butt. That's why you have generally more fat on your butt than other areas, because you need cushion. Any other ideas? Why do we, all right, like right now, I'm a little bit fatter than I used to be, mostly because I've been taking in more calories than I've been burning. So why would humans or anything else, why would we do that? Why do we get fatter? Store energy, good. So we have cushion, store energy. And what's another one that probably humans don't think about much, because we don't need fat for this purpose, but other animals do? Warmth. Good. You guys got it. Yep. All three. Energy storage, cushioning, and insulation. Very good. And I might ask that on the exam, but it's pretty simple, right? And when you think of fat, that's what you should think of. And the reason we bring it up, because again, when we talked about starch, we talked about its function, right? It was to store energy for plants. Glycogen, its function was to store energy for animals. Cellulose is for structure for plants, right? So then again, we're just asking the same questions. What are fats for? Energy storage, cushioning, and insulation. So any questions about this slide? Okay. You do need to know the difference between saturated and unsaturated. And I'm sure you've heard those words a lot before, and now we're going to explain what they mean. When we say saturated or unsaturated, all right, if you weren't thinking about fats and you're just having a conversation with somebody and someone said, oh yeah, my shirt's completely saturated. Well, what do you think they would mean? I guess it depends on the context, but if someone was like, they went for a run and it was raining and they came back with, yeah, my shirt's completely saturated. What does that mean? Yeah, it's like soaked in water, right? It's as full of water as it could be. That's what saturated means, right? So in this case, saturated still means the same thing, except we're not talking about water. In this case, we're talking about the hydrogens. So if something is saturated, it has all the hydrogens that can fit in that molecule. It is saturated with hydrogens. If it's unsaturated, it does not have the full number of hydrogens. And that's as simple as you need to know for the exam. But to explain why it doesn't have the full number of hydrogens, it's this right here. This carbon is double bonded to that carbon. And as you learned earlier in this chapter, carbons can only bond 4 times, right? So this carbon has bonded 4 times, twice to different carbons and then twice to different hydrogens. This one bonded once to a carbon, bonded once to a hydrogen, and instead of having another bond to another hydrogen, this thing has bonded twice to a carbon. So again, the reason, not that you need to know this detail for the exam, I just want you to understand why it's not saturated with hydrogens. It's because of these double bonds. So in order for a fat, like the whole triglyceride, in order for a whole triglyceride to be considered saturated, all 3 of those fatty acids, because remember it's 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acids, all 3 of them would have to be saturated. So for a saturated fat, all 3 would have to look like this. If you have even one that looks like this, one of the 3 that looks like this, it is then considered an unsaturated fat. And I will point out too, because I like how your book points out what polyunsaturated means. Polyunsaturated means, see how this one's got like 1 bend, it has the 1 double bond. If it's polyunsaturated, that means this chain would have more than 1 of these double bonds, which means it gives it a more crooked shape, and that'll be important a little bit later. But the point here is, again, saturated is nice and straight, saturated with hydrogens. Unsaturated is not saturated with hydrogens because it's got these double bonds. And again, it also gives them the kinks. It gives them its weird shape. So any questions about this slide? Again, know what saturated, unsaturated, and polyunsaturated means. That will be on the, definitely unsaturated and saturated will be on the exam, maybe polyunsaturated. And another thing to point out before I move forward is this is just an example of an unsaturated fat. They do not all look exactly like this. First of all fats can be shorter or longer than this. And for this unsaturated fat, that double bond could be anywhere along this chain. And again, we could have polyunsaturated fats where there's more than just one kink in the chain. So the point is there's a lot of varieties when it comes to unsaturated fats, even saturated. They're all straight, but they can have different lengths. Most animal fats are saturated fats. So if you take a notes and want a shorthand, you could put it that way. Animal fats equals saturated fats. For studying purposes, that is a correct statement. Animal fats equal saturated fats. Of course, not all animal fats are saturated, but for the purposes of studying, you should identify those two things with each other. The reason this is important is because they easily stack solid at room temperature. And let me back up. I know you're taking notes, and I'm sorry, but let me back up and show you what I mean. These are saturated fats, right? They're nice and straight. So imagine trying to stack a bunch of those things together. It would be easy because it's just like that, right? Just put a bunch of nice flat things on top of each other. It'd be like stacking Lincoln logs or Jenga cubes, whatever, right? It's just a bunch of flat things stacking on top of each other, books, whatever. It's easy to stack flat things on top of each other. And that's what makes them solid at room temperature. Because they stack, they fit nice together, right? So they don't move around a lot. Because of that, they're solid. And the reason that that's important, that's not a trivial thing that they're solid. The reason that's a bad thing is because that's what clogs your arteries, right? Because they're solid, so they don't let blood flow back and forth. Atherosclerosis is what happens when your arteries get clogged. I'm not going to ask you the name of that on the exam, but just do know that that's why saturated fats are bad for you. They stack easily, therefore they're solid at room temperature, therefore they kind of clog your arteries, and obviously that's a bad thing when your blood can't flow. So any questions about that slide? All right. Conversely, most plant and fish fats are unsaturated, and that's why most plant and fish fats are relatively healthy for you. They've got those weird kinky shapes, right? So they don't stack together. So they can't, be solid at room temperature. They're liquid. And again, because of that, they clog your arteries less, or sometimes not at all. Tropical plants are the exception to this rule. Not that I'm going to ask you that on the exam, but that kind of makes sense because tropical plants are in hot areas. So, you might figure they would have fats that are accustomed to that, so to speak. Here's a picture from the beginning of the chapter. This little kid's eating chocolate. Chocolate, obviously, when it's in its package, is solid, right? But then you apply a little bit of heat to it and it melts. Anyway, we don't have time to get into that. But yes, for the exam, you should identify or associate saturated fat with animals and unsaturated fat with plants and fish. And you could look this up too. This is, again, more great ideas for independent work. Where do we get specifically where do we get these unsaturated fats? And what are their names? And why are they good for you? Here's a picture from your book. I'm certainly not going to require you to memorize this. I think there's a test like this on the study guide where they give you a picture of this and ask you questions about it, like which one of these three has more saturated fats? And all you'd have to do is look at the graph and answer it. But I'm not going to ask you to do that on the exam. This is just for your own knowledge. I'm sure you may have heard the word trans fat before or hydrogenation. So we'll talk about that, even though I might not. I probably won't ask you about it. Food manufacturers often convert unsaturated fats to saturated fats. The reason being is because, you think about something like margarine, right? You want something that looks and feels like butter, so you want it to be solid. You want to be able to pull it off with a knife and spread it as it's solid. So that's one of the reasons that they would want to convert it. To do that, obviously, if it's unsaturated and you want to make it saturated, you want to add hydrogens to it. And that process is called hydrogenation. It also helps food from not spoiling as quickly. It's really good for frying, and I don't have time to get into that, but you could look that up for independent work. Why is that so good for frying? And again, that makes it solid at room temperature. But this can also make something called trans fat, and trans fats are very bad for your health. And again, we don't have time to get into trans fats. You can look them up for independent work if you want, but because we don't have time to get into it, and because your book doesn't really get into it much, it will not be on your exam. So are there any questions about this slide? Thought we had more time than we did. Omega-3 fatty acids. I'm sure you've heard of these before. These are things that you get like when you take the fish oil pills. They're good for you. These are healthy acids. They reduce heart disease. They reduce arthritis symptoms. They reduce the symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome, and they're found mostly in oily fish and nuts. None of this will be on the exam. If anything, just know that omega-3 fatty acids are healthy. Again, I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but there's so many good independent work options for this chapter because we all eat. So these are all things you should be familiar with. But if you want to look it up, when we say you can find these in oily fish, what do I mean by oily fish? You could write a paper on that. What are the oily fishes? And also, which particular nuts? Which nuts have more of it? Which nuts have less of it? Any questions about omega-3 fatty acids? Okay. Here's like a little picture that kind of shows everything we've already talked about. Again, you should associate saturated fats as being unhealthy, generally speaking, and generally from animals. And you should associate unsaturated fats generally as being healthy and from plant, fish, and nuts. But again, remember, there's obviously exceptions to those rules. Trans fats are not healthy, and they are technically unsaturated fats. But anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. So the next category of lipids is steroids, but I don't think we can cover steroids in 5 minutes. So we're going to end it there. Does anybody have any questions? Today, when you send me, I'll remind you again, if you need to send me an email for attendance, whether you're online or in person. And when you send the email, if you use the word monkey wrench, however you want to do it, just use the word monkey wrench in there, or even just put it, monkey wrench. You'll get a little bit of extra credit for attendance. This also helps me know to find out who's actually watching the videos and who just says they are. So anyway, are there any questions? If not, then I'll see you during office hours and or lab. And again, obviously lab is not mandatory. I mean, not being there online. Doing the lab is, but you don't have to be there online if you don't want. Good timing.
Did anybody catch what word we were supposed to type in? Because I was writing my notes and I didn't catch that.
I think it's monkey wrench.
Monkey wrench. All right. Thank you so much.